Good day, everyone. My name is Trisha Sanihon, a Master of ASEAN Studies student, and I am here today to present my thesis proposal on my chosen topic, ASEAN Women Cultural Workers in the Film and Theater Industry and their role in resolving the negative societal impacts of political instabilities, the case of Indonesia and Cambodia. A brief background and rationale of the study. Southeast Asia has been the site of a number of instances of political violence in its history. In the 20th century, the region has been beset with conflicts due to the interplay of the Cold War and the continuing indigenous independence movements against Western imperialism. It is in this context that two instances of the worst mass killings occurred. The Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge from 1965 to 66 and the Khmer Rouge Genocide from 1975 to 79. The focus of my study will be on the ASEAN women cultural workers and their role in addressing negative societal impacts in Indonesia and Cambodia. But first, why cultural workers? Cultural workers produce texts that can provide an avenue for reconstructing the history of political violence, which, more often than not, leaves out the voices of the victims, particularly the marginalized, and for this study, the women. Cultural texts can also provide an avenue for promoting reconciliation. But why women? According to Claudia Card, women play a central role in preserving and passing on the traditions, languages, and daily practices from one generation to the next, and in maintaining family and community relationships or the social vitality. As this study focuses on the effects of the political instabilities on women in particular, it would also make sense to examine the works of women cultural workers, by women, about women, for women. The study would be focusing on two texts, Faisa Marzueki's The Silent Song of the Gentle Flowers and Kulikar Sotho's The Last Reel. The Silent Song of the Gentle Flowers was first presented by Institut Ungu at the Goitain House in Jakarta in March 2014, and it focuses on a granddaughter's attempt to piece together her grandmother's traumatic past during and after the anti-communist purge. The Last Reel first premiered in the 2014 Tokyo International Film Festival and focuses on a daughter's quest to complete the unfinished film that featured her now ill and traumatized mother in her younger days before the Khmer Rouge. It also serves as a meta-narrative on Cambodia's film industry, which was nearly decimated during the reign of the Khmer Rouge. In fact, the actress who played the role of the mother is one of the very few artists who survived the period. Both the play and the film focus on women's experience of trauma from these two events of past political violence and on the role of the younger generation in resolving the negative societal effects of these traumatizing events. To go a bit deeper into the works, The Silent Song of the Genjer Flowers is about the experiences of the Gerwani women, short for Gerakan Wanita Indonesia or the Indonesian Women's Organization. The Gerwani is an Indonesian communist women's mass organization whose members have been particularly targeted and demonized for their supposed role in the September 30th incident. Women suspected of being a member of or affiliated with the Gerwani were rounded up, incarcerated, tortured, raped, and in some cases killed. The campaign of slander continues up to the present with the propaganda film Pengkhianatan G30S/PKI or the Treason of the September 30th Movement (PKI), still being shown in schools where the Gerwani women are depicted as lewd and murderous women who danced while they tortured and killed the army generals and dumped their bodies in the well. In the play, Ming's mother Rakma had killed herself because her husband left her upon learning of Rakma's mother's, Suhartini's, connection with the Gerwani. Ming, who despite having grown up to fear the Gerwani, tries to get to know her grandmother's and her friend's side of the story. In her play, Faisa Marzueki captures how the act of telling their stories is an act against despair that carries with it a faint hope of healing. For the women survivors of the purge, this was a leap of faith to end their emotional isolation from the younger generation who had been brought up to fear and hate them. In the last reel, Sophone runs away from home after her father, a former Khmer Rouge cadre, demands an arranged marriage between her and the son of a superior officer. Sophone finds refuge in an old dilapidated cinema where she finds an incomplete film that featured her mother before the Khmer Rouge took power. With the help of the cinema's elderly projectionist, and later also with her boyfriend's help, Sophone remakes the missing parts of the film. In the process, she discovers more about her mother's traumatic past, her father's role in her mother's tragedy, and the horrific intimacy of victims and perpetrators living side by side, reflecting the state of Cambodian society today. By premiering the film 40 years late, Sophone hopes to remind her mother of the life she had once lived and to mend the psychological scars that still haunt her. According to the director, the film's meta-narrative suggests that the process of making and watching films can help reconcile the past and the present, victims and their tormentors, parents, and children. This study aims to answer the question, how can ASEAN women cultural workers assist in resolving the negative societal impacts of past political violence? The objectives of the study are to identify the roles that women cultural workers in the film and theater industry played in helping the citizens overcome the trauma caused by military and political conflicts, to assess the strategies they have employed using the medium of film and theater in helping reduce the traumas caused by the conflicts, and to identify the lessons that can be drawn from their works and experiences that may help improve the manner by which the ASEAN community can deal with the culture of accountability in post-trauma periods or situations. Significance of the study. Upon my review of related literature, I noted that there was a scarcity of material on the intergenerational trauma brought about by histories of mass killings and atrocities in Southeast Asia, and a gap in the study of women cultural workers and their role in resolving the negative societal impacts of past political violence. This study aims to address both. For the study area, I will be focusing on the two works as they tackle the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next and explore how the younger generation can help bring about some semblance of closure and reconciliation in societies deeply wounded by their violent histories. For the analysis, this study will be analyzing reviews of the film and performance. For the review of literature, I examined works that tackled the mass killings and atrocities in Southeast Asia in the 20th century, specifically the Anti-Communist Purge in Indonesia and the Khmer Rouge Genocide in Cambodia. I also examined works pertaining to the legacies of mass killings and atrocities, namely intergenerational trauma, loss of social vitality, and violence against women. And lastly, the role women cultural workers play in addressing collective trauma. For the Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge, I examined the works of Jeffrey Robinson, Catherine McGregor, Jess Melvin, Annie Pullman, and Brian Miner. McGregor, Melvin, and Pullman collected essays on the latest research on the anti-communist purge, including new interpretations on the causes, dynamics, and legacies of the killings. These include the reframing of the killings from the state-sanctioned account of spontaneous collective violence in response to the supposed evils of communism to deliberate state policy, the recognition of the silence of the international community, especially the Western states, on the matter of this massacre, the new evidence from survivors and perpetrators, and the attempts at transitional justice from within Indonesia. This multi-angled approach helped provide the much-needed Indonesian context to the genocide and its impact on society. This is a worthy answer and companion to Robinson's attempt to shed light on the genocide, which suffered from misconception and uncertainty over even the most basic facts, such as the agency behind the killings and the number of victims killed. Robinson's contribution is particularly significant in that he identified the broad historical conditions that gave rise to the purge, and the most important observation that mass violence is not a natural or inevitable consequence of any of these historical conditions. Rather, it requires an agent to articulate that conflict can and should be resolved by violence, and an institution with the inclination and capacity to do so. Similar to the conclusion drawn by MacGregor, Melvin, and Pullman, Robinson argued that the mass killings were not only organized by the army, but was also facilitated by powerful states and international conditions. Miner's thesis on this subject supports this observation by focusing on the US's role in the genocide. Miner concluded that while the US was not responsible for the overthrow of the left-leaning President Sukarno, who had been vocally anti-West in his rhetoric, the US did support the anti-communist regime of General Suharto, who succeeded Sukarno. This support, which came in the form of covert supply of arms and medicine to the army, as well as the propagation of the military's version of events regarding PKI's culpability in the murder of the generals, inevitably included the massacre of the suspected PKI members and alleged sympathizers. For the Khmer Rouge Genocide, I examined the works of Ben Kiernan, Tom Fothrop, Helen Jarvis, and Rebecca Gidley. Ben Kiernan has produced extensive scholarship on the Khmer Rouge Genocide. In his book, The Pol Pot Regime, Race, Power, and Genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, 1975-79, he contextualized the rise of Pol Pot, covering the French colonial legacy in Cambodia, the ongoing war in neighboring Vietnam, and the U.S. economic and military destabilization of the country. Kiernan's critical essay, included in The Century of Genocides, Critical Essays and Eyewitness Accounts, summarized concisely the rise of Pol Pot, the mechanics of power, and the genocide ideology espoused by the Khmer Rouge, the historical forces at work, the victims and perpetrators, the long-term impact of the genocide on the victim groups, and the international response as well as the current state of the issue. This essay provided a timely update, although more recent scholarship on the issue is scarce. To complement Kiernan's scholarship, Fothrop and Jarvis focused in their book on the difficulty of bringing to justice the perpetrators of the Khmer Rouge genocide. This included acknowledging the efforts made by human rights specialists, legal scholars, academics, and Cambodians in exile in documenting as early as 1979 the human rights violation under the Khmer Rouge rule. However, the international inertia that Kiernan mentioned characterized the period meant that these efforts had made little impact. Fothrop and Jarvis further elucidated on the international events and interests at play that made justice elusive for Cambodia in the years after the genocide, even after the creation of the ECCC. One of the latest scholarships on the subject of the Khmer Rouge genocide is Gidley's book on the illiberal, transitional justice and extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. Gidley further contextualized the ECC from its creation to its difficulties in achieving its supposed goals of promoting democracy, ending impunity, and strengthening the rule of law. One of these difficulties is the Cambodian government itself, as it sought to control the narrative produced by the ECC to one that is politically beneficial while still having the appearance of independence. Fothrop, Jarvis, and Gidley's works then help in contextualizing the difficulties that Cambodia and its citizens are facing in attaining justice after the horrors inflicted by the Khmer Rouge in their 4-year reign of terror. Intergenerational trauma. Southeast Asian societies are marked by traumatic histories, from the period of colonization, the brutal struggle for independence, the painful nascent stages of nation building, to oppressive dictatorships and murderous regimes. Even as these nation-states continue to forge ahead through these histories, the wounds from particularly painful episodes, such as mass killings and atrocities perpetrated by one's own countrymen, continue to change the societies and citizenship in complex and profound ways. This can manifest as intergenerational trauma, wherein the collective trauma that the society experiences remains unaddressed and is transmitted from one generation to the next, as defined by Adonis. Because the multi-generational impact of socio-cultural trauma affects the feeling of membership and belonging within that community, addressing these traumatic histories then become imperative to resolve negative societal impacts. Loss of social vitality. Claudia Card's Genocide and Social Death posits that central to the evil of genocide is social death, wherein besides the loss of life, the communal and intergenerational relationships that give life meaning are also destroyed. For Card, genocide also implies a cultural death. social vitality, which exists through relationships, contemporary and intergenerational, are what creates an identity that gives meaning to life. Thus, the loss of social vitality is a loss of identity and a loss of meaning for one's existence. This kind of harm that victims of genocide experience by virtue of their group membership is not captured by other crimes. In Tazrina Sajad's The Post-Genocidal Period and Its Impact on Women, the study looks into the mass rapes and sexual violence against women during these periods and their effects afterwards, both on the women and on their respective communities. Due to their role in caring for the young, elderly, and the wounded, women are considered as protectors of the rest of the community, which unfortunately makes them a target, with their bodies being turned into a battleground by the perpetrators of genocide. The mass rape results in the social destruction of communities, symbolically destroying the ability and determination to hold the community together, since the woman is seen to be the nurturer, the caregiver, and the carrier of culture. Sajad's study aligns with Card's observation that women play a central role in preserving and passing on the traditions, languages, and daily practices from one generation to the next, and in maintaining family and community relationships. This is especially significant since traumatic events like genocide cause disruption, or in some cases, a major rupture in family and communal relations. Violence against women. In On the Battlefield of Women's Bodies, an overview of the harm of war to women, Hines provided an overview of the unique harm war imposes on women, that is, the trauma inflicted in brothels, rape camps, sexual trafficking, and rise in domestic violence. The study presents an overview of the impacts of war on women, looking at the figures on the death and disability of women in the war, the indirect effects of war, rape and sexual violence, widows of war, and the war refugees. This study sets out to define war by looking at its full life cycle to measure the toll of war on women's health and identifying the limits and to define health as more than the absence of disease. Ringa's scholarship on the subject shed light on the plight of women accused of communist affiliation, particularly with the Gurwani during and after the Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge. In her article Sexual Slander and the 1965 to 66 Mass Killings in Indonesia, Political and Methodological Considerations, she explained that due to the campaign of slander against the Gurwani, women accused of communist ties were rounded up and subjected to horrific torture, sexual molestation, gang rape, and coercion in confessing their alleged role in the deaths of the generals. She further elucidated on the legacies of this sexual slander on the women and their children who had absorbed the state-sanctioned version of history and in the wider societal context wherein women's political participation is stigmatized. This is supported by Pullman's study, The Specter of Communist Women, Sexual Violence, and Citizenship in Indonesia, where the author also found that the systematic demonization and destruction of a particular communist women's group, the Gurwani, had resulted in the reconfiguration of women's role in post-New Order Indonesia. In An Incomplete Narrative, prosecuting sexual violence crimes at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, Killian explored the underreported cases of sexual violence under the Khmer Rouge. According to Killian, cases of sexual violence against women were largely underreported due to the assumption that the Khmer Rouge regime prohibited and punished immoral offenses and the prevailing culture of blame which had discouraged victims from coming forward. However, survivors have been coming forward with their stories, which reveal the wide variety of rape scenarios and sexual violence that occurred under the Khmer Rouge, including but not limited to gang rapes, rapes within cooperatives, rapes prior to execution, rape with objects, sexual slavery, sexual mutilation, abuse of pregnant women, forced nudity, and sexual exploitation in forced marriages with cadres. The last resulted in the creation of a state-enforced culture of rape and the normalization of sexual violence within marriage, with state actors compelling the violation and becoming direct perpetrators on occasion. This is further corroborated by Morag in her article Gendered Genocide, New Cambodian Cinema in the Case of Forced Marriage and Rape. She identified the unique Cambodian genocidal form of forced marriage and subsequent rape which had become part of the official Khmer Rouge policy. Due to Pol Pot's directive to increase the Cambodian population from 7 to 20 million in 10 to 15 years, aggravated by the high death rate and low birth rate under the regime, more than 250,000 young women are said to have been forced into marriages with older KR cadres. To ensure consummation during the wedding night, KR spies were placed under the houses, which meant that even if the woman was not gang raped, she was subjected to the gang's gaze. Morag further highlights that the supervised rape and the collective gaze turned the forced marriage into one of the worst forms of collective sexual abuse and degradation. Sajad and Hines' articles shed light on the particular plight of women during wars and genocide, identifying the unique harms that women experience. Sajad goes further in highlighting the role of women as a carrier of culture and whose violation and death result in the social destruction of communities. This is in line with Card's observation in her article, which specifies the evils that are unique to genocide, such as the loss of cultural heritage and intergenerational connections. Meanwhile, Wiringa, Kilian, and Morag provide specific instances of gendered violence against women during the Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge and under the Khmer Rouge regime. Women cultural workers' role in addressing collective trauma. Cinema played a powerful role in Suharto's New Order in propagating the state-sanctioned version of events regarding the murder of the six generals by the September 30th movement, or the PKI. This is exemplified by the propaganda film Pengkhianatan G30S/PKI, or the treason of the September 30th movement/PKI. The film is shown yearly on broadcast television and is compulsory viewing for school students. According to Hadley, this film has traumatized generations of Indonesian citizens with its gory depiction of violence, as well as the effective demonization of the PKI and the communist women members who allegedly danced while the bodies of the generals were dumped in wells. In Hadley's article, recalling and representing Cold War conflict and its aftermath in contemporary Indonesian film and theater, she observed that those who made films and performances on the 1965 Purge were overwhelmingly young and who had no direct involvement in the events depicted. Raya Morag's The New Post-Khmer Rouge Women's Cinema, The Horrific Intimacy of Auto-Genocide, and the Ethics of Unforgiveness explores the works of two Khmer women filmmakers and their contribution to the Cambodian society, that is, the spectrum of post-genocide ethics of forgiveness, from unforgiveness to aphoretic reconciliation. Morag's work presents a view on how the arts and culture can articulate and interrogate such a traumatic event in their history and present a possible way of moving forward. In the specific case of Cambodia, it raises the question of what kind of healing or reconciliation can be had when many of the perpetrators were people the victims and survivors knew, some of them neighbors, even family members. Furthermore, only the high-level perpetrators were tried, with the low-level perpetrators still living alongside with the survivors of the genocide. Morag focused on the role of cinema as medium, particularly meta-cinema, in articulating what could not be said outside of it, that is, the confrontation with low-level perpetrators, the juxtaposition of the past and the present, etc. Morag's methodology involves taking two films and analyzing them each through the lens of Derrida's concept of forgiveness. Her approach is also informed by Claudia Card's concept of social death as central to the evil of genocide. Morag's study takes this even further by exploring how women who experience unique harms during war and genocide and who play a central role in preserving traditions and cultural heritage can help in shaping the ethics in a post-genocide society. She does this by examining the works of two Cambodian second-generation Cambodian filmmakers, which explores a spectrum from operatic reconciliation and unforgiveness. For the research method, this study uses qualitative textual analysis, which, according to McKee, is a central methodology of cultural studies. Despite its name, textual analysis also involves the context in which the text is produced, or the way in which cultural texts emerge from and play a role in the changing historical, political, and social context. This study will be examining not only the text itself, that is, The Last Reel and The Silent Song of the Genter Flowers, but also the historical, political, and social context in which they are embedded. When analyzing the texts themselves, the focus will be narrowed on how these tackle the trauma inflicted by the cases of mass killings and atrocities in their respective societies. For this research, the source materials are the 2014 film by Kulikar Soto, The Last Reel, and the 2014 play by Faisa Marzueki, The Silent Song of the Genter Flowers. This study will also compile and analyze the reviews for these cultural texts. The focus of the study is to determine how ASEAN women cultural workers in Indonesia and Cambodia help address the collective trauma inflicted by the Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge and Khmer Rouge Genocide. Central to this is the study of the genocidal events with their legacies of violence and discrimination that are transmitted from one generation to the next, forming a layer of unresolved trauma around them. For the restoration of social order and the healing of the individual victims to be possible, remembering and telling the truth of these traumatic events are prerequisites. Herman identified the central dialectic to the trauma is the conflict between the will to proclaim the events and the will to silence them. This is where the ASEAN women cultural workers come in, specifically Kulikar Soto and Faisa Marzueki, as they tackled the genocidal events in Cambodia and Indonesia, respectively. For Marzueki, by shedding light on the plight of the Gurwani women, her narrative of events went directly against the official account perpetuated by the Indonesian government. While the account of the genocide under the Khmer Rouge's four-year reign is largely undisputed, there is still difficulty in discussing the complicity of the middle and low-level perpetrators who still live among the surviving victims in Cambodia today. For Kulikar, by tackling this complicity, she provided an avenue for its recognition and the complexity of any type of reconciliation among victims and perpetrators today. For this study, reconciliation is the restoring of connections, the social vitality, the loss of which, according to Card, is central to the evils of genocide. This is what will be examined in the works of Kulikar and Marzueki and the reviews of their works. The discussion will follow the conceptual framework illustrated in Figure 1. Paulo Freire's critical consciousness theoretical framework will form a basis on how the texts will be examined and interpreted. In critical consciousness, the objective is to address multisystemic oppression, internal and structural, which is the core of most individual and social dysfunction. Oppression dehumanizes people, both the oppressor and the oppressed. And for people to reclaim their humanity, it is necessary for them to think critically about oppressive realities and challenge inequitable social conditions. This study will also be drawing from Claudia Card's works on the theory of evil and of genocide as social death. These works would help frame the specific evils of genocide and how women in particular are affected as they play a central role in maintaining and preserving the social vitality of their communities. According to Card, when a group with its cultural identity is destroyed, the survivors also lose their cultural heritage and sometimes even their intergenerational connections. Card's theory is important for this study as it allows us to better understand how women are affected by these atrocities and therefore how they can shape the culture of accountability afterwards. Research work is expected to commence this month after the final thesis proposal has been approved by the thesis committee and reviewed by the IREC. The target for the submission of the first draft of the thesis manuscript is on the first week of May, with 3 weeks allotted for revisions. The final manuscript and publishable article are scheduled to be submitted in June 2022. As Ming says in The Silent Song of the Genter Flowers, we have to learn about our history, even the blackest parts of it, so we can understand our own life. Our region's history of mass killings and atrocities may be very painful to look back on and examine, but it is in learning about these events and in acknowledging and trying to understand them, especially from the perspective of the victims, of the marginalized, that we may begin to find a way towards healing and reconciliation. That is all for my presentation today. Thank you for listening.